So this afternoon, we're going to talk about Socratic questioning. And so, who can describe what Socratic questioning is?
Leading a person to sort of know what it is they know.
Leading a person to know what they know. Good. Okay, what else?
It's helping them solve their own problems, essentially. It's kind of what she said, leading them to help solve their own problems.
Asking them questions that will help them to solve their own problems. It can be asking them a question for which you already know the answer. But if they give the answer, then they're owning it. And it's much more powerful than if you just give them the answer.
A
Right?
lot of times they know that you know.
Yes.
'Cause
Okay. Anything else you can think of that would describe Socratic questioning?
It's a way of teaching people while asking questions, like you're developing a way to find insight for them, or helping them to develop their own insight.
Socratic questioning helps them to develop their own insight. Okay, good. You have already done some Socratic questioning. You actually did some Socratic questioning when you did building the relationship in our first class. Because you had to ask questions, right? And Socratic questioning often involves not just the asking the first question, but even asking a question about the answer. And when they give an answer, asking a question about that answer. Because this probes deeper into the problem and can get you to the core issues or the core mistaken belief. So I'm mad at my husband. Why are you mad at your husband? Because he doesn't come home to dinner on time. Well, what is really upsetting to you about the fact he doesn't come home to dinner on time? Well, because I've made this great dinner and he doesn't show up. And what is really awful about that for you? Well, I feel like he's being very disrespectful to me. And what bothers you about somebody being disrespectful to you? You keep asking questions and you get down to a real core issue that kind of follows through in a lot of different areas of their lives. And oftentimes you get to a self-worth issue, or you get to an issue that kind of has a mistaken belief that's popping up in a lot of different places. Sometimes we use Socratic questioning to gather information. So you did that in your class where you built the relationship. And the more questions you ask about any one thing, the more you're building a picture of what is really going on. If you just take one statement from a client, you have the tip of the iceberg. But if you keep asking questions, you can get a bigger and bigger picture of what's going on. And a lot of times, if you just let clients run the therapy session, they'll throw out something and then they'll go to something else. I will literally say, could we stop here for a minute? I'd like to ask you, could you tell me a bit more about that? Because that's, you think, wow, that's a problem. Can you tell me more about that problem? I'd really like to understand what is that about? And it's unraveling things and helping the client then to come to insight, because they haven't really done that process of really digging in over the problem. They're just dealing with the tip of the iceberg. When they get a better understanding of what is really going on, they're in a better position to resolve it in some way. So, it's an active interaction between you and the client that results in insight for the client. So, it's done, they're gaining insight, but it's done in a gentle way, in a caring way. It's a respectful way, using leading questions. And so we talk about confrontation. Well, Socratic questioning is, in a way, can be a confrontive measure, but it's done in such a gentle way by asking a question we already know the answer to, that they're confronted with what they're doing. A really simple one is when Dr. Phil says, how is that working for you? Well, we already know the answer to that. Dr. Phil knows the answer to that. But we get them to say, it's not working for me. Well, that's much more powerful. Now they're more ready to change because they're owning the fact it doesn't work. Okay? Also, it can be moving from the general to the specific. They'll make a general statement, but we want to get down to the specifics. Now, how do you do that? Well, anybody ever been a journalist? What are the questions journalists ask? What's one?
Who?
Who? What else?
Why?
What?
Why? What's another one?
Where?
Where? When?
How?
How? What? I think I learned what, where, why, how, who. Now, if you think about Socratic questioning, a lot of that is asking one of these questions. Other than that, tell me more about that is another way. That's not a what, where, why, and who, but tell me more about that is a way to start digging in. So let's look at some of the ways that you might use Socratic questioning. And this questioning might be around the situation. It might be around the thoughts or around the feelings. So what's so upsetting to you about this situation? Why do you feel the way you do? One of the things I always say is, everybody has feelings about what happens, but in this situation, why is this so upsetting to you? What makes this so particularly awful to you? Because that's where we're going for the private logic. When people go to extremes, why is this awful? Awful is an extreme. And we want to find out, what are they thinking that they see it as awful? Albert Ellis, who later in life admitted that his stuff was based on Adlerian psychology, would call it awfulizing. Awfulizing is taking it to a negative extreme. And so it might be a male client who says to his wife, "You're always controlling me." That's an extreme. So what are some of the other things? You heard Bob say, what? What is the worst thing that could happen if what you're anxious about happened? And then what would you do then if that happened? And then what would you do? I talked about that earlier. So they are able to face their fear, Fears often come from mistaken beliefs from early childhood. For example, if somebody is afraid that their spouse is gonna leave. Now, anybody would be upset if their spouse left unless you were really happy to see them go. But some people go to a major extreme about the fear of their spouse leaving. And think it is gonna be awful. It's going to be the end of everything. And if you start asking about what is really awful about that, and you keep asking questions about why is that so upsetting to you? Why is that so upsetting to you? And if they don't have a chance to think, the final answer would be, I'll die. And then they'll stop and they'll say, well, that's crazy, I know I won't die. But what I will say, but when you were 3 years old, you would have. Because if you are abandoned at 3 years old, you will die if nobody comes to help you, right? But that fear stays even though they forget all about the logic of how they came to that. And so they have to walk themselves through it with a lot of your Socratic questioning to get the insight that, you know what, it's going to be upsetting, it's gonna be disappointing, I'm gonna be very sad, but I will survive. I will be able to take care of myself, I will pull myself together, and life will go on. The other extreme response they can sometimes end up with is, I'll be nothing, I'll be nobody. In this case, if he leaves me. So here's a person who's got their self-worth tied to who they're tied to. So by digging in, you come down to the core belief, and then you can help the client to have insight that where this belief comes from, and that it is private logic rather than common sense. And you can put that in the form of a question. Do you think it's really true that you're gonna die if your spouse leaves, or that you're gonna be worthless if your spouse leaves? And they'll say, intellectually, no. But down here someplace, I really feel that way. Well, when they say down here, it really feels that way, that's a mistaken belief. With their intellectual mind, they can give you the right answer. But in the core of who they are, they're believing the mistaken belief. And they have to become aware of what it is and how they got it, and that they can change it before they're gonna change and really feel it down here, okay? You can ask many different questions about, okay, who doesn't come up a lot, you know, who was involved, who was there, that kind of thing. But why do you think that happened? Why do you think that person responded the way they did? You know, oftentimes they'll complain about a person's response, but they never think about why the person responded that way. Can you think of any reason why that person responded that way? For example, if a parent attacks their adult child, you know, children always take it on, it's all about me. But when you're talking to an adult and they're really devastated over what the parent said to them, you can begin to ask a question they've never thought about. Why do you think your mother does that? What do you know about her childhood that could have led her to be the kind of person that would do that? A lot of times, to help clients get better, we have to help them to get insight into why the people around them are the way they are. Because remember that diagram I gave you this morning, topical issues, personal issues, relationship issues, they will sometimes see it as relationship issues if their parent attacks them, when truly it is a personal issue of the parent. They do this because of their own feelings of inferiority. What happened to them as a child, and they're reacting the way they learn to react because of that experience. And when a person can have insight into why other people do what they're doing, they can go from feelings of criticism to feelings of understanding. They can also start to separate who they are from what the other person is doing. So the other person's behavior is not stating who you are or your value and worth as a person. It's stating more about them. Bob said that, didn't he? In the tape that you saw this morning. He said, when people do that to you, it says more about them than it does about you. Clients have never thought about that because as children they learn to believe that it's all about them. It's all about themselves. Whatever happens, it's not because there's some flaw in their parents, it's because there's some flaw in themselves. And a lot of what we do in therapy is helping them to rectify the mistaken ideas they developed as young children so that they'll become more healthy. You might ask questions that would have to do with their goals in therapy. You might ask them, if you've asked them about what the problem is, you might ask them about, well, what would you like to accomplish? If you, what would that look like? If you were to accomplish it, what would that look like? So you are seeing a couple for marriage counseling, and you say, what would you like to accomplish? And they say, well, I'd like to have a better relationship. Good luck, you know, you're not getting much out of that, right? But if you say, if you were to accomplish that, what would it look like? What would be going on in your relationship that's not going on now? And sometimes they haven't even pinned down what that is. Sometimes they'll start out by saying, gee, I'm not even sure I know. Well, gosh, here's my old saying, if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up someplace else. So I guess we better figure out where you're going. So pleasers often don't know what they want because they've spent their entire life being a chameleon, being whatever anybody else wants. And it takes some time for them in therapy to begin to identify, well, what do I want? What would please me? What would I like in life? If I could have the life I wanted, what would that look like? And they can't answer that in one session. They have to really think about it because they've never thought about it before. They'll say, I've never thought about that. Well, it's time to start thinking about that. So you might even give them an assignment. I want you to go home, and when you come back next time, I want you to come back with at least 3 things that you would want if things were to change. What would that look like for you? What would be different than it is now? What would you be doing that would be different? What would the other person be doing that would be different? Another question you might ask that's very interesting is when they tell you a problem, to ask, what have you tried so far to solve this? And how did it work? You get a lot of insight into how these people function when you ask what they've already tried. Furthermore, you know better than to go there. It eliminates a few things you're not even going to bring up, right? Because they've already tried it and it didn't work. It also tells you if there's more of a lifestyle issue. If the things they're telling you they tried should work, but they didn't work in this case, then I might say, well, what happened that it didn't work? How did it get derailed? What interfered with your ability to accomplish that? And we begin to really get the deeper issues out. So, another question would be, what are your choices here? Because one of the things we have to do in counseling is to hold the clients accountable. So we need to help them, one, become aware of the fact that they do have choices. They may not always like the choices. So in a marital situation, in a very general sense, you can live with this for the rest of your life. You can get a divorce, or you can change. Now they might say, or my spouse will change. And I'll say, not gonna work. You know, if the relationship is gonna work, everybody's gonna have to change. Do you think you can change your spouse? How's that worked for you in the past? Have you been successful in changing your spouse? Do you think it's possible that you might need to make some changes yourself? What do you think you need to do to make this a better relationship? Very good question. Because the person is always thinking what's wrong with the other guy, right? What do you think you need to do differently if this is gonna get better? Let's take we have a parent and a teenager. So, you know, you say, well, I hear what you've been doing with this teenager. How is that working? It's not working, that's why we're here, right? Say, okay, let me ask you this. What, and I'm gonna ask both of you, the parent, the child. Parent, what do you think that you might need to change about yourself or the way you deal with your teenager to make this better? Teenagers are loving that. But then now I'm going to the teenager and I say, what do you think you need to do so that this would go better with your parent? Now, any answer they give that is an improvement, you're gonna say, wow, great ideas here. But now we've gotta start using those ideas to make it better. But do you hear they're coming out with it, rather than you say, you know what, you need to knock this off. You need to stop that, or whatever. When you can get the individual to own, what you will find in therapy is any two people that come together are doing this. Let me tell you about him. You know, he is really screwed up, you know, and he'll say, no, wait till I tell you about her. She really needs work. And when we can get the client, by asking Socratic questions, to begin to dig in and think about themselves and their part in this. That is a big step. And questioning, do you really think you're gonna be able to change your spouse? You're telling me it hasn't worked in the past. Do you think it's gonna work any better in the future? So, do you think it's possible that maybe both of you are gonna have to change if you want this to work? So oftentimes we're asking questions that the answer is obvious. But we want the client to get it through their head, and the best way to get it through their head is when they respond with the right answer. And so, where were you when that happened? When did it happen? When did it first happen? Great question. They're saying, I'm depressed. Well, when did you first become depressed? We're looking for what triggered this, right? Or the one of the couple says, we just don't get along at all. Well, when did you first start having problems? This can be very interesting. Sometimes they'll say, oh, well, we were having problems even before we got married. Well, what were the problems that you were having before you got married? Why were you having problems? Tell me more about that. Sometimes, here's one. couple that are having problems in their marriage. And they say, you know, we haven't been getting along for a few years. And you say, well, when did you first start not getting along? Now, sometimes it's interesting because they came in with marital issues and then all of a sudden they say, oh, that was when John had his affair. Oh, John had an affair. Oh, that's the first time we heard about that. Sometimes it's, well, you know, it started right after we had our first child. Well, tell me how life changes after a couple has their first child. Anybody?
The mother becomes more focused on the child and less focused on the relationship with her husband.
Yes, the mother becomes more focused on the child, less on the relationship. Okay, so how does dad feel?
Excluded.
Excluded, even dethroned. You've heard that word before, right? Firstborn, secondborn. Okay, so he feels excluded, he feels left out. He feels like, what happened to this wonderful relationship we had? I got married for the relationship and now there's no time for the relationship, everything's about the baby. Well, now we've gotten to the core of the problem in a way. So I might then ask, how much quality time do the two of you have? And I define it. I'll say quality time is eyeball to eyeball. It's not we're both in the house at the same time or we're both watching the same movie. It's when you're having quality time, eyeball to eyeball, talking to each other. How much of that do you have? And find out. And then the husband says, oh, she wants to have all of my time. And you know, I've got a job. I'm working 40, 50 hours a week. And she just wants so much time for me. And I'll say, really? Okay. And then I might say to her, if we were to think of Monday through Friday, what is the minimum amount of quality time you could live with from your husband? And it's amazing. They'll say, gosh, if I got 15 minutes of quality time, I'd be happy. And he's looking at her like, really? And I say, on the weekends, how much quality time do you really need from your husband to be happy? And she says, gosh, you know, if I had an hour or two, that'd be good. And he's again looking at her like, really? But he went to the extremes. Either she wants me to spend all my time with her, or we don't have any. And I can't spend all my time with her, so she's got a problem. I have to work. She just doesn't understand. It's amazing how 15 minutes of quality time can change a relationship. So then you might ask, well, what would happen to the woman in this case? What would happen if your husband was around for 15 minutes a day for some quality time and an hour on the weekend? And she'd say, oh, gosh, our relationship would be so much better. And he's saying, oh, I can do that. Okay. But you see how asking questions can really help people to solve problems. But they're really doing the work of figuring it out, but you're doing the work of coming up with the questions, which can be challenging too. But if you think about, you know, what, where, why, when, how, who, how did this happen, who did it, you know, when did it happen, how did you deal with it, what are some ways that you can think of that you could deal with that would be different than what you've done in the past. Another great one is, tell me about a time when you had a problem, this kind of problem, and you solved it. Because, you know, when we don't solve a problem 10 times by accident, oftentimes there was a time when they did solve it. Tell me about a time when you actually did solve a problem, or a problem like this. And get them to describe the success and say, oh, you already do that. do you think you could try that again? Another one I've used is, people can often do at work what they don't do at home. So I would say, if you had this problem with a colleague, how would you deal with it? What would you do? How would you handle it? And they proceed to tell you, great way to handle it. Then you say, well, what do you think would happen if you use this very same technique with your spouse? Oh, I suppose it would work with her too. Yeah. But you know, when we're raised in a family, we often fall back on what we've seen done in a family. We get trained for what we do in work, and we learn what works and it doesn't work when we haven't been trained at home. So we use one method at work and another method at home. I've often had to say to CEOs and managers, we'll say a guy, because it's more often a guy than a gal, you know, you're a manager at work. How do you deal with problems with your colleagues that are managers? How do you work things out? And I'd say, you know what? I want you to think about your marriage as a business. And in this business, one of you is the baker and one of you is the salesperson. Who's in charge? When are they in charge? Who's in charge of the baking? Who's in charge of the selling? Who's in charge of buying a $5,000 oven? Well, hey, if we're gonna spend $5,000, even if I'm in sales, I wanna be involved. Say, right. In a relationship, there are departments. Sometimes you agree, in this department, this person will be in charge, in this department, this person will be in charge, but some things you have to have a board of directors meeting. But in no way is one the boss over the other. You're in a partnership. So sometimes you can use metaphorical type situations and ask questions about the metaphor, because they will give you common sense answers to the metaphor. And then you can ask, and how would that apply if you were to use that in the relationship? And then they get it. Because they use their private logic when they're just reacting. But when you create an outside situation, a metaphorical situation, they will answer it with common sense. Do you get it? So what you're going to be doing this afternoon is you're going to be getting together with a partner, and your partner, who is the client, can talk about any kinds of issues, problems, or whatever. If you can, as a client, try to talk about an overall issue so that there are sub-problems. Do you know what I mean? Rather than just say, I've got one problem, my son won't brush his teeth, you could be done with that in 5 minutes. You know, is it a relationship problem? Consider a relationship problem that has subsets of things that are problematic within the relationship. Because really all therapy is about relationships, isn't it? And so I just want you to get a feeling of what it's like to put things in the form of questions and to dig deeper or to help somebody get insight with the use of questions. Now again, I'm going to tell you, I am not suggesting that all therapy every hour for the rest of your life is going to be Socratic questioning. This is one of your tools that can be extremely helpful and used alongside of others. Just like you saw with Bob Bartholow, he did some Socratic questioning and he got a lot of insight into what was going on, and he used some questions that he knew the answers to get her to get that insight that he was getting about what was really going on, and questions even about what would work for her. So that's what I'm gonna want you to do, okay? Any questions about Socratic questioning, how to do it, whatever? No? Okay, that assumes that we've all got it. Okay, I'm gonna stop the tape now and, gotta go this way.